Last week, I mentioned that the recent video showing Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark acting friendly on the sideline, laughing and high-fiving, was nothing more than a carefully planned public relations move. The reality is that basketball fans and analysts have doubted the connection between White and Clark from the very start of the season. Just a few days ago, White did an interview where she repeatedly insisted that she and Clark were incredibly close and perfectly aligned. She made these statements on the Curran and Company radio show, clearly attempting to control the narrative before things spiraled out of hand for the team. However, we need to acknowledge Coach Anderson on X for sharing a vital piece of video that the WNBA's legal team will likely try to remove very soon. We all know how quickly league officials act to scrub controversial clips from the internet. Despite their efforts, they cannot stop this coverage because Dre Fiver from Street Hoops is working late to deliver the honest, raw details that major media outlets avoid discussing. What this recording reveals is shocking, undeniable evidence of severe internal conflict within the Indiana Fever. White was captured on camera losing her temper and shouting directly at Clark on the sideline. This represents yet another intense, troubled moment between a head coach attempting to assert absolute authority and a rare basketball talent who is tired of carrying the blame for the team's shortcomings. Let's look closely at the recording to see how it unfolded. The video shows White criticizing Clark as if every single issue on the roster is her fault alone. Interestingly, this occurred during the very same game where White chose to bench Clark in the opening quarter. Immediately after she sat down, the Portland Fire put together a dominant 13-2 scoring run. It makes no sense to blame Clark for that collapse. If you observe her posture on the screen right now, Clark raises her arms in sheer disbelief, looking at her coach to ask what more is expected of her. She gestures in frustration, shakes her head, and a close reading of her movements suggests she is muttering a complaint to herself. She appears completely exhausted by the lack of respect. What White does next, though, offers a real glimpse into the psychological state of the team. After her outburst, White glances around the arena to check who might be watching, suddenly remembering that thousands of lenses are focused on the floor. She instantly attempts to mask her anger, realizing that the television cameras or a fan's phone might be recording her. To look calm, she begins chewing her gum intensely and tries to appear collected, but the moment has already been caught. This situation looks terrible, and no amount of public relations management can hide it. There is an undeniable conflict happening behind closed doors in Indiana, and Coach Anderson captured it perfectly. White berated Clark regarding her defensive play, held her accountable for collective mistakes, and dismissed her from the huddle to substitute Raven Johnson into the lineup. This public reprimand humiliated the league's top star in front of a packed arena. The media clips circulating highlight just how misleading the sports landscape can be when trying to protect an organization's image. Documents from Athlon Sports reveal that only days prior to this matchup, White claimed on air that she held immense respect and appreciation for Clark as both an individual and an athlete. She stated that they shared an identical drive, work ethic, and desire for perfection. White literally mentioned enjoying their daily collaboration and appreciated Clark's openness to being guided and challenged. Yet, the actual sideline behavior we witnessed tells a completely different story. That behavior cannot be classified as constructive instruction. It looks like a coach venting tactical frustrations onto her premier player. Local reporters and major networks like ESPN want audiences to believe the transition has been flawless, suggesting that hiring an experienced coach who won a title in Indiana 10 years ago would instantly resolve the instability seen during Clark's rookie season under Christie sides. Instead, the reality is surfacing, and it looks far worse than anyone expected. Let's look at the strategic elements of this situation because it is highly frustrating. Consider the events on the court prior to the blowout. According to the official WNBA box score, Clark was isolated defensively for 2 consecutive matchups against elite opposing guards. When the New York Liberty compete, does their staff scream at Sabrina Ionescu and bench her on the spot? When the Dallas Wings operate, do they treat their marquee players this way? Does Paige Bueckers face public embarrassment from her coaches for a defensive lapse? Not at all. Yet, White behaves as though she can treat Clark like a reserve player just to establish dominance over the group. She focuses heavily on Clark's defense, even though the roster has allowed over 100 points in multiple games this season. Looking at the footage, Clark seems to communicate that she followed the designated game plan and positioning, questioning what else she could have done. Rather than modifying the defensive strategy or offering useful guidance, White tells her to move away and calls for Johnson to enter. Let's review the moment the clipboard was thrown to ensure it wasn't missed. Pausing the video right here, you can see the aggressive arm movement. White does not merely tap the board. She slams it down against the bench with visible anger. It is hard to deny that this looks like a coach who has lost control of her emotions and her players. She summoned Johnson to check in, and the tension was palpable even through the screen. A commenter on Twitter noted that this is the only time White shows this level of intensity, pointing out that she failed to show that same energy when the team struggled with controversial officiating earlier in the week. It appears she is redirecting her strategic frustrations toward Clark, using her to deflect from her own errors. Whatever White communicated in that instance, it was incorrect, and the data proves it. Look at the statistics displayed from that specific stretch of the game. The final box score shows that Clark played just 22 minutes and recorded a mere 6 points. That is an incredibly low total for an athlete who averages nearly 24 points per contest this year. She ranks third in the WNBA in scoring and holds the top spot in assists per league records. This drop occurred precisely because her coach disrupted her playing rhythm, impacted her confidence, and kept her on the bench during pivotal moments. Meanwhile, Johnson played 10 minutes off the bench and contributed 3 points. The situation looks incredibly mismanaged. White faces immense pressure after this incident, and there is no simple way to reframe or alter what happened. The footage is rapidly spreading across Twitter, and fans are expressing outrage because they feel a star player is being mismanaged in plain sight. This situation is stunning because it aligns with everything discussed on Street Hoops over the past month. Standard public relations tactics will not fix this. Benching Clark in the first quarter when the team had momentum allowed the Portland Fire to take advantage of the error with a 13-2 run. The Fever never recovered from that single tactical choice, a blunder that rests squarely on White. That decision halted the team's rhythm and disrupted the harmony of the locker room. The Indiana front office, overseen by General Manager Amber Cox, must recognize that their current approach is damaging the franchise just to satisfy a coach's authority. White was brought in to provide stability and veteran guidance for elite talent, but she is currently acting too rigidly for the big stage. The organization will undoubtedly try to eliminate this video from public viewing because it confirms what many suspect. White and Clark are dealing with serious, unresolved friction behind the scenes. For weeks, major commentators insisted that fans were simply inventing rumors. A detailed article published by The Ringer just last week asserted that Clark supporters were creating unnecessary drama, shifting blame from Kelsey Mitchell to Christie's sides, and now toward White. The publication stated that fans were making groundless claims about the coach damaging Clark's confidence or punishing her. However, those claims are hard to dismiss as mere rumors when video evidence shows the coach shouting directly at her, slamming equipment, and telling her to move away. This looks less like a theory and more like a visible workplace conflict. It raises questions about why the roster and coaching staff were structured in a way that creates so much unnecessary pressure for Clark. Consider the sequence of events. In the 2026 WNBA draft, the Indiana Fever chose Johnson with the 10th pick out of South Carolina. As reported by Heavy.com, fans immediately expressed concern over the selection due to the intense competitive history between Clark and Johnson from their college careers. Many remember the 2023 Final Four when Clark famously waved off Johnson, treating her as a minimal threat from the perimeter, which became a widely discussed moment in women's basketball. Johnson later shared on podcasts that the subsequent online criticism nearly drove her away from the sport before she found redemption against Iowa in the 2024 national title game. Despite this history, the Fever management placed Johnson in the same backcourt as Clark and hired White, a coach with a strong personality. When Aaliyah Boston spoke on her podcast recently, she tried to minimize the drama, claiming that fans focused on the rivalry far more than the players did and that everything would settle during training camp. Yet, it is difficult to overlook the underlying tension when the head coach visibly uses Johnson as a tool to discipline Clark on the sideline. When White yells at Clark, slams her clipboard, and sends Johnson into the game, it feels like more than a standard substitution. It sends a direct message. It signals to Clark that her position is not entirely secure and that she can be replaced by an individual with whom she has a public history the moment she challenges the coach's authority. This appears to be the most challenging team dynamic Clark has encountered. At Iowa, she played under Lisa Blutter, a coach who excelled at empowering her abilities and constructed a system designed to maximize her unique playmaking talents. Even during the previous season under Christie's sides, despite the disorganization, the franchise clearly understood that their progress relied heavily on Clark's performance. Now in 2026, it seems the internal environment of the Fever is working against that success, which is highly perplexing. The situation is deeply frustrating because an organization should not allow its head coach to treat a foundational player in this manner. Reviewing the footage leaves many fans shaking their heads, as it points toward a challenging period ahead for the Fever and a potentially compromised season. At this rate, it remains uncertain if the team will even qualify for the postseason. The organizational system appears to be struggling from within. The WNBA is currently experiencing record-breaking viewership, packed arenas, and lucrative television partnerships. The vast majority of that growth is tied directly to the cultural impact of Clark. Despite this, the individuals responsible for directing her career on the court are treating her as an impediment rather than a premier asset. You have a head coach in white who praises her connection with a player on public radio, only to treat that same athlete poorly on the sideline 48 hours later. A roster cannot achieve a championship under that style of leadership. Internal unity is impossible when coaching personnel are throwing equipment and shouting at the premier player of the franchise. It represents a significant issue that management must address before the competitive year is completely lost. Let's look at how deep this institutional deflection goes because the details are troubling. This is not merely a single emotional outburst on a random night. It looks like an effort by the Fever organization and WNBA league officials to suppress any narratives that complicate their ideal corporate image. Consider the reasoning behind hiring White. According to a report by The Athletic, the ownership group believed that sides, despite securing a playoff spot, lacked the public relations polish and championship experience required to navigate the massive media attention surrounding Clark. They sought an established figure, a respected Indiana native, who could handle press conferences smoothly, interact well with reporters, and project total stability. However, looking past that polished corporate exterior reveals a traditional coach who feels challenged by the significant influence and leverage a 24-year-old star holds over the sport today. In traditional basketball structures, the head coach functions as the absolute authority whose directives are followed without debate. Clark, however, is a unique figure who drives the economic success of the league. She is a primary reason charter travel is now standard across franchises and why games are being relocated to NFL-sized stadiums to meet ticket demand. When a coach realizes that nearly every fan in the building purchased a jersey bearing the star player's name rather than the coach's, it can create a difficult psychological dynamic. This tension is reflected in how local media covers the organization. If you review the post-game media sessions reported by the Indianapolis Star, reporters barely questioned White regarding the sideline incident. They avoided the core issue entirely, focusing instead on safe, routine questions about defensive rotations and execution in the third quarter. There seems to be a real fear among media members regarding the loss of their press credentials or exposing the internal flaws within the WNBA organization. That is precisely why independent platforms like Street Hoops are necessary. It explains why I stay up until the early hours of the morning reviewing every frame of fan-recorded footage that becomes available. Basketball fans deserve to see the unfiltered truth. They deserve to know that while marketing campaigns show Clark smiling, the reality on the bench involves a highly volatile situation. The emotional impact on Clark is becoming visible in her expressions during games. The enthusiastic, uninhibited long-range shooter who excelled at Iowa is gradually looking worn down and mentally fatigued by her coaching staff. At Iowa, if Clark missed a distant shot or turned the ball over on an ambitious pass, Bludder would encourage her to keep playing aggressively. That trust allowed her to become the sport's all-time leading scorer. Under White's restrictive, defense-oriented approach, every single misstep is treated with extreme severity. If Clark misses a defensive rotation against a top guard because the interior help arrives late, White treats her like an inexperienced player who does not comprehend the game. This brings us back to the decision to incorporate Johnson into the lineup, a choice that remains confusing to anyone focused on team chemistry. When management drafted Johnson, they clearly wanted to add a physical defensive presence to the perimeter, but they overlooked the psychological impact. Sharing a locker room with an athlete who once bested you on a national stage naturally creates unspoken friction. When a head coach intentionally uses that specific individual to replace you the moment you voice frustration on the sideline, It looks less like a basketball strategy and more like an attempt to break a player's confidence. White appears to be trying to diminish Clark's influence to prove that coaching authority carries more weight than generational talent. Contrast this with how top-tier teams across the league handle their premier players. When the New York Liberty face adversity, Sandy Brondello does not stand on the sideline shouting at Breanna Stewart. When the Las Vegas Aces encounter a difficult stretch, Becky Hammon does not throw her clipboard and tell Aya Wilson to leave her site. They interact as professionals and modify their tactics to highlight their stars' strengths while protecting their limitations. In Indiana, the system seems structured to emphasize what Clark struggles with rather than what she does best. They employ slow, predictable half-court offenses that allow opponents to double and triple team her without facing consequences on the weak side. When the offense stalls because other players cannot create their own shots, Clark routinely receives the blame. This entire environment is approaching a dangerous tipping point, and if General Manager Amber Cox does not step in to set clear boundaries, the franchise risks sliding backward significantly. An organization cannot promote an athlete as the face of women's basketball while permitting a coach to reprimand her publicly on a regular basis. Fan sentiment is already shifting, as comment sections across sports blogs and social channels show overwhelming criticism of White. People are traveling across the country and investing substantial money into tickets, accommodations, and apparel just to watch Clark get benched early and face intense criticism during timeouts. It results in an unappealing product and represents an unfair situation for the fan base that supports the team financially. We need to look at that sideline sequence one more time, especially since mainstream outlets will try to describe it as standard, passionate coaching. Notice the expression on White's face, the tension in her jaw as she chews her gum, and how she points her finger directly at Clark. Constructive coaching focuses on instruction, adjusting technique, or inspiring better effort. This moment looked personal, resembling a coach trying to establish authority over a player who has surpassed her in cultural impact. Clark's response confirms it. The raised hands, the head shaking, and the verbal reply show she is no longer a quiet rookie just happy to participate. She is an established star who recognizes her value and is done accepting blame for a coaching staff that appears overwhelmed. If you care about the game, please share your perspective in the comments below because we cannot allow this footage to be ignored. Click the like button to help this coverage bypass the algorithm before any attempts are made to remove it. Share your genuine thoughts on this sideline moment between White and Clark. Let me know if you believe White should be replaced immediately, or if Clark should consider requesting a trade to an organization that values her talent. Be sure to subscribe to Street Hoops for straightforward basketball coverage, as I will be hosting a live broadcast to discuss this entire situation tomorrow. We will analyze the details even further, so stay tuned, and I will see you all during the stream. This is Dre Fiverr.